Okay, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Coppus, here with my guest, Dr. Ryan Cedermark. How are you doing today?
Hey, what's up, Dr. Coppus? Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to sit down and talk with us and share your wisdom with our listeners.
Yes, for sure.
So the topic of discussion for this episode is the gut-brain axis, right? So that's a super interesting topic, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it. But first, I'd like to know a little bit about your background, what got you interested in this particular topic, and so on.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm a chiropractor. I went to chiropractic school and graduated in 2011 down at Life University in Atlanta, Georgia. And I wanted to get into healthcare with the alternative mindset, treating patients more holistically than just kind of, providing medication for patients. So when I was in chiropractic school, I was learning a lot of information that sometimes I couldn't really figure out the answers to. Sometimes why does a chiropractic adjustment necessarily work the way it does? And going through the regular program, the education was great, but I was like, I need something more. I need something to answer these questions. And that's when I, found out about the Carrick Institute. And at the time when I was in the program, Dr. Carrick and his team was teaching on campus. So we were fortunate enough to, as students, to be able to go to the weekend seminars and take the courses. And I found that jumping into the neurology that he was teaching really explained a lot what we were doing as manual therapists and as chiropractors and alternative practitioners. So I loved it, and I loved everything about it. And then I started to ask some more questions to myself, like, all right, well, how could we do this a little bit differently? What role does medication play into all this? And so that's when I kind of backtracked a little bit and decided after I finished with chiropractic school, I go back and get my nurse practitioner degree so that I could have basically my goal was to bridge the gap. Not necessarily wanted to practice medicine, but I knew that, once I got out in the field treating patients from a chiropractic perspective, so many patients were taking medications. Sometimes what I'd see on my exam, they were side effects of the medications they were taking. And the biggest thing I found, which I'm sure you see too, is that none of their primary care providers ever really had an exit strategy for their medications. So I really wanted to be able to provide that service for patients and say, hey, what medications are you on? How is it affecting your lifestyle? How can we change your lifestyle and maybe get you off your medications and make your body better and brain better all throughout the process? So that's kind of what led me into this whole world of gut-brain axis, because I don't think I would have ever known about it if it weren't for the functional neurology and seeing the types of patients that functional neurology brings with it. So I know Dr. Carrick provided courses on traumatic brain injury, and unfortunately at the time when those courses came out, I was going through nursing school, so I just was too much to handle. But I started doing some research on traumatic brain injury, and that's when I really got into working with patients and providing functional neurological care with patients. And that actually led me to my first patient that made me fall in love, I guess you would say, with the gut-brain axis. So that's kind of how I got involved with the gut-brain axis. It was just one patient one day that had suffered an injury that no one else could help, and we figured it out by doing a little bit of research on the gut-brain axis.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Or I guess, as I should call it for her, it was the brain-gut axis.
Right. So for those who aren't aware, it just sounds, you've got your brain, you've got your gut, but not to everyone, it may not sound like they are connected, per se. So can you kind of talk about the interplay that the two have together and why this connection is so important?
First of all, you always have to make sure you follow your mother's advice. You got to follow your gut. And your mother's right. Your gut has tons of millions of billions of important neurotransmitters and microbes that play a role in cognition. And what the gut-brain axis is basically a communication highway between the brain and the rest of the body. And one of the most important areas is the gut. And when we talk about the gut, we're talking about the small intestine, the large intestine, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, all those play an essential role in your health. But there are different messengers that go up and down and communicate back and forth through different types of pathways. And what most people are probably familiar with is the vagus nerve. And that's one of the nerves that we learned about in chiropractic school. It's one of the nerves that I learned a little bit more about in functional neurology. And it's a nerve that I really learned about when dealing with the gut-brain axis, because the vagus nerve is a major highway of communication between the brain and the gut and the brain. And it's an actual nervous system tissue, so it's called a canalized pathway, which just means that it's a structure that is important for brain to gut, gut to brain communication. So the gut-brain axis is just a really important communication pathway between the brain and the rest of the body. And one of the most important things is that that we should remember is that our brain is a big sensory receptor. So when we're born and as we grow and as we go through life, our brain's always receiving information, sending signals out, and then trying to get more information back. And so the gut-brain axis and the vagus nerve is the same thing. The brain's always looking for information from the gut, and the gut's sending back signals to the brain. So in short, it's a big highway of communication that's super duper important that I found out for your overall health and well-being, especially for your brain health.
Exactly. So basically, if I have problems in my gut, whether it be digestion or a liver issue, it may be prudent to look at the brain, look at the vagus nerve to see how we can actually stimulate that and affect that to actually change gut function and vital function there. And is that something you've seen in practice?
Yes, exactly. So what really led me to doing more research about this and learning about it and reading about it was this one patient. She was a patient who had actually suffered a really bad concussion, and she got to a point after a few weeks after her concussion where she was unable to actually tolerate food. So no matter what kind of food it was, she couldn't put it in her mouth, and she couldn't get herself to digest it. She kept throwing the food up. She would also have these crazy immune responses anytime she put something in her system. So what I started doing was I started researching, okay, this is a young girl who's now at a point where she's done all of the correct things. She's taken all the right nutritional supplements. She's gotten all the bad foods out of her diet, like the common known inflammatory allergens like gluten and dairy. She's done tons of functional medicine testing, but she still can't tolerate food, which made no sense to me. It's like, all right, you're eating a clean diet. Why isn't the brain appreciating what you're putting in? And what I found was when she met with me, no one really asked her questions about her concussion and asked her questions about her brain function. And what we learned was that her brain just wasn't sending the right signals to be able to tell the body that it was ready to start eating food again. Some people would say she was kind of more in like a higher sympathetic tone or in a sympathetic state, but there was just tons of dysfunction from the brain to the gut. So you'll hear a lot, and if you do some research on the brain-gut axis, you'll hear tons of information about how important gut health is for brain health. But like you mentioned, what I'm trying to advocate to people is that your brain health is 100% important for your gut health, and it's because of these pathways.
Yeah.
There's tons of research that shows now, well, I guess I shouldn't say tons, but there's a good amount of research that shows now that if there is changes in the brain, you can see physical changes in the gut. And one of the easiest examples of that is a physical injury to the brain, like a traumatic brain injury or concussion. The research is showing that there's actually changes in the gut within hours after a bump to the head. And so these patients, or I guess they were mice in research, because you can't do that to humans, but they were getting what's called leaky gut. So their intestinal lining, their tight junctions, which should be really, really tight, kind of like a screen door, they would start to kind of open up and creep open. And what would happen is they get all these large particles in their bloodstream, which shouldn't be there. It'd activate an inflammatory response and start to get sick. So what was cool about the research that this group did was they actually went back a few years years later and said, okay, there's tons of reasons why this patient could have gut issues from brain injuries, but could it possibly be that there's a lack of vagal tone in that system? So what they did was they actually provided a vagal nerve stimulation before the TBI, and what they found, or before the concussion or traumatic brain injury, and what they found was that the mice who had the vagus nerve stimulation before they got bonked on the head, they actually retained their gut lining mucosa, so they didn't suffer the same injuries that a normal mouse would have. So I just say, with vagus nerve and with brain and gut, the stronger your brain is, the more resilience you have in your gut microbiome.
Absolutely. And you had mentioned that they stimulated the vagus nerve. So what are some ways that you've seen that have helped strengthen the vagus nerve and, help that the brain gut axis?
Yeah. So that it all, like, I always just kind of refer back to this one patient because she was kind of my for learning this, but vagus nerve stimulation is a pretty hot topic now. It was first introduced to help patients that were suffering from epilepsy, and what they would do was invasive nerve stimulation. Now they're finding out that there's so many areas where the vagus nerve innervates that you can do what's called transcutaneous vagal nerve stimulation. So the therapies can be pretty simple. There's lots of devices that are now coming out, that some are getting some FDA clearance, but there's some simple stuff that you can do to stimulate your vagus nerve. And what we did with that one patient in particular was I started to look at her vagal nerve health, and I found that it was pretty shot. So instead of trying to change her diet more and more and more, what we just started doing was doing some brain therapies that would activate the vagus nerve. And what I always tell patients, before you can even get activation to the vagus nerve, you've got to try to reduce the stressor. So if, for instance, your stressor isn't a physical trauma, if it's an emotional stressor or if it's an environmental stressor, that's got to be kind of taken away from the scene before you start to build good vagal health. But vagal nerve exercises can be as simple as doing mindfulness meditation, deep breathing exercises. There's a really simple Pilates move that they use called straw breathing, where it's basically working out your diaphragm, but basically you're doing some breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. So it can be as simple as mindfulness exercises, breathing exercises, and then it can get a little more complex. Coming to a guy like yourself, where you can do some different types of stimulation to the areas of the face that are innervated by vagal branches and other stuff like that. So there's lots of stuff you can do. I always tell people first, though, try to get the stressor out of your life. Start with some sort of deep breathing or meditative stuff. And then one of my favorite things to do is do walking or running, because I'm a runner, and the research is showing that as long as you're not, chronically inflamed from too much running, if you're running, it's actually changing your microbiome. And I think it's because of something what's called interoception. So basically, you're increasing the awareness of your brain's internal awareness of the body, and you're distending the vagus nerve and waking up and getting blood flow to all the areas. So I think simple stuff just is getting good exercise, running. There's a gentleman called Dr. Stephen Porges, or his name is Dr. Stephen Porges, and he's the brains behind something called the polyvagal theory. And he even talks about how just getting involved in good, healthy social interactions lights up your vagus nerve. So simple stuff like that. And then it can go all the way to doing transcutaneous stuff, like stuff that you guys would do at your clinic. And then also, you can go hardcore and get some sort of surgery, but I don't recommend that.
And he has a book, right? What was his book called?
The Polyvagal Theory.
That was the book? Okay.
But then he also has a book that's actually a little bit more easier to read. And it's kind of like, it's almost like a summary book, but there's some, you can grab some clinical applications out of it. Okay. Very, very cool guy. And his work is really cool. He basically talks about how your primitive systems, they were designed to survive. And then the newer part of the vagus nerve, which is more of the front part of the vagus nerve from a different area of the brainstem is the area that's responsible for rest and digest. And when that area is offline and you lose that parasympathetic tone, you start to kind of regress into that more primitive fight or flight state. So his work's really cool, and yeah, definitely worth checking out.
Cool. So we talked a lot about the brain to the gut connection so far, but obviously this is the brain-gut axis, gut-brain axis. This is a two-way street. So can we talk about a little bit about what happens when the gut may dysfunction and then lead to brain issues down the road?
Sure. Yeah, because it's a two-way path.
Yeah.
And there's obviously they go hand in hand, but there's obviously the chance that your brain is really well intact and you're being exposed to environmental triggers. And there's studies that show that stress can reduce the mucosal lining in your gut. Food pathogens or inflammatory foods can mess up your gut. So I like to think, I really do like to think that our gut is one of our first barriers. Our body's made up of these barrier systems to keep us alive and healthy. And we have barrier systems in our skin. We have barrier systems in our lungs. And the gut, which is one of the most important barrier systems, is one that can be attacked pretty easily. So what's really interesting is you can see neurological changes in a patient who actually has gut dysfunction first. And one of the best examples of that is neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease. The research is showing now, which it has been for a little bit, before you even start to see neurological symptoms in patients with Parkinson's disease, they actually start to have gut changes. So they'll start to lose gut motility and they have constipation. And then they'll start to lose their smell, and then you start to see these neuro changes. So there's a chance of the gut failing, and then when the gut starts to fail, your barrier system breaks down, and you can think of it as like a castle, and so the moat has been taken over, and people are breaking down the walls, and all these bad things are starting to come in. And once they get into your bloodstream, you have an immune reaction. So your brain's like, oh my gosh, there's something bad happening down there. I got to help out my buddy. So he sends down some different types of immune cells to take over and help out. But unfortunately, a lot of times we continue to add insult to injury by the foods we eat, the environment we're in, and these inflammatory mechanisms get into the bloodstream and they start to creep up and attack the blood-brain barrier, which is another very, very important barrier. They break down the blood-brain barrier, and then you have neurological issues, just like you could see in Parkinson's disease. So That's a little bit of gut-brain, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it doesn't have to go that far. It could be as simple as I got IBS, I got bloating, I ate that Krispy Kreme donut that I shouldn't have and washed it down with some regular milk, and now I have brain fog. So one of the other simple signs is like, hey, how do you feel after meals? Are you not eating the right foods? Are you getting some distension in your gut? Are you getting bloaty and farty? And instead of getting gut bloat, you've got brain bloat. So it could be as simple as that too.
Yeah. Well said.
But there's a connection.
Absolutely. And you had mentioned, obviously eating Krispy Kreme donuts, stuff like that, maybe not so good for the gut. Can you touch on maybe some foods that you tend to see are less healthy for the gut microbiome and the gut overall, and some things that maybe are more healthy and beneficial for the gut and the microbiome in general?
Sure. You just have to drink celery juice, and you can only eat healthy foods only. No, I'm just kidding. Like there's so much. Like the interesting thing is everybody's a little bit different, but there are some really common allergens. I know everyone talks about gluten. You do really have to be careful with the foods you're eating, not just because these foods are being changed, genetically modified, but they're also, being sprayed with the wrong type of stuffs like glyphosate. So foods, any foods that are not organic and are not really natural foods, gluten and dairy, which we shouldn't really eat as well, those can inflame the gut. Those are some common ones. Everybody's different. Everybody's tolerance levels are different. But I always recommend for my patients trying to go back a little bit more. If you're vegan or vegetarian, it'd have to get switched up, but more of a Paleolithic diet, which I'm sure you're familiar with. just eating lean, healthy, organic meats, making sure that they are organic, because you're not just eating the meat, you're eating what the animal had been eating, and or what they, what they were stuffed with. This was crazy. I forgot this happened, but I was listening to a podcast and there was like a truck driving up the Northeast coast and it like spilt Skittles everywhere. and the cops like pulled him over, like, where are you going with these like old Skittles? And they were like, hey, we're going to feed like these cows, because that's what they eat. It fattens them up, and like it's their source of whatever, so they get fat, and then they die, and then we eat that. So grass-fed organic is the best thing to do. I do, we eat meats, so we go that route, but then we eat lots of vegetables, lots of organic fruits. And I know it sounds hard, and food's always a tough topic, but a little bit can go a long way. Just making small changes in your diet every day, you'll start to notice that you don't really gravitate towards those foods that you really want. So that's a hard question. Everybody's so different, and
Yeah.
I know like gluten sometimes is talking about religion, but if you want to do what's best for your brain, you've got to really try to minimize any of those common allergens, any of those grainy foods that could spike your blood sugar, and just try to stick to a lean meat, vegetable, fruit diet.
Absolutely. So this whole gut-brain axis, it sounds like you can have a lot of problems, a lot of symptoms that go along with it. As a clinician, it sounds like you're really trying to figure out chicken or the egg when it comes to this connection somewhat. So how do you approach that? How do you determine, okay, we're going to have more success by treating this connection from a brain approach versus maybe a gut approach, even though we do know there's the interplay?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it always starts, I think like whatever you're putting in your system, your brain is going to use it as fuel. So for me, it does always start to say, hey, what are we feeding our system? If you are eating bad foods, if you're putting bad stuff into your diet, it gives us less of a chance of making optimal progress with brain function. So I typically always start with trying to modify lifestyle and diet first with patients, and then we also we check different brain regions, and we do a brain assessment, obviously assessing areas that are associated with vagal pathways. And we look at that and we see how well they're functioning, which is something, I'm super grateful that I've learned, because when you're looking at a neurological exam, you can see pathology and then you can see slight dysfunction. And I think that we've been able to learn how to really see some slight dysfunction, which some people miss. So looking for some inconsistencies and insufficiencies in the neuro exam, but really trying to work on some gut health and some lifestyle health first, and then using some neurology to try to make those pathways stronger and healthier, because you also need to make sure that there's good brain communication to gut, because the gut is what tells the brain is what sends signals to the gut to create good blood flow and get oxygen rich blood to the area. So if you don't have that and contractility of the gut, and if you don't have those signals working at all, it doesn't really matter what goes into your system. So I always say a little bit of functional medicine, functional nutrition, then start looking at the brain, activate a little bit of brain, and then trying to just bring them all together at home. So I know that's still interplay, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So, okay. No, that was good. So, and like I kind of mentioned or alluded to this earlier, but you can kind of have an assortment of different symptomatologies, when there's an issue with one of these two things. You had mentioned IBS. You had mentioned some neurodegenerative diseases as well. What are some other, I guess, common symptoms that patients present with when, you see a dysfunction in the connection between the gut and the brain?
So I would say anything that's not necessarily diagnosed yet, I would say if you're noticing that you're not the same person that you used to be. So if you notice that there's changes in your attention span, if you notice that there's changes in your personality, just a little bit, like you're a little bit less motivated, you're a little bit less fun to hang out with. From a brain perspective, you kind of like lose your your zest for life a little bit. Not necessarily like you're completely down in the dumps, but things are just kind of changing. You don't care as much. Those are some subtle brain signs that I would say are telling you that there's some sort of issue in the gut-brain pathway. Obviously, there's other connections. So anything that you see on the skin that may not necessarily look healthy. So changes in acne, different types of autoimmune disorders, just stuff like that. Like if you're seeing different types of spots on your skin that aren't necessarily supposed to be there or were there before, that's typically a sign of gut dysfunction. And I always tell patients too, if you see stuff happening on your skin, there's probably other stuff happening in your gut too, because it's all tissue. Obviously, there's antibodies to different tissues and all that, but there's got to be some sort of systemic inflammation going on. So I just tell to keep it general and simple. Anything that you may notice that's just a little bit off about you, especially the front part of the brain, like your personality, your zest for life, stuff like that. But then also if you're walking around and like you ate a meal and you're like farting a lot. So if you're passing gas, if you're on the opposite side and you're constipated, that's typically some subtle signs that there's some changes in your gut-brain axis.
Absolutely.
From what I've seen in the clinic.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, by addressing the things you do in your clinic with your patients, as well as, focusing on diet and lifestyle, you should be able to, hopefully change these patients' zest for life and all these other things that you had mentioned, which, goes very deeply in their lives and quality of life. So.
Yeah, those are all just important things for brain health because, I'm sure you've seen it too. It's sad when you see someone who's young and they're alive, but they're just not really living.
Yeah.
And there's so much to be grateful for, and hopefully, like, if your brain's working really good, you can see those things. Mm-hmm. If it's not working so good, it's tough to see those things sometimes. So, yeah.
Great. Well, Dr. Cedermark, we are coming up on the end of our time, but I wanted to make sure we have enough time for you to give us any closing remarks about this topic that we may have missed.
Sorry, dude, you went out real quick.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to give you a chance to give us any closing remarks before we wrap things up. Anything we may have missed throughout the show?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
So my biggest thing for patients is, and anyone listening, if you feel like there's something not right in your system, in your body, if you feel like you're not yourself and you feel like something's wrong, there most likely is. I always tell my patients, you know your body best. So listen to your gut. If you have a bunch of gut dysfunction, don't necessarily listen to it. But listen to your body, and if you know something's wrong, a lot of these things show up on a scan. A lot of these things sometimes won't show up on the routine blood work that you see. So if you're feeling like you're not yourself, there's most likely something going on. The gut-brain axis is just one thing that could be affected by what's going on. So just make sure that you advocate for yourself as a patient, or if you're a practitioner, just make sure you're doing your own homework and try to find people that are doing types of neurological care, like Dr. Coppus and his team. And also, I always say you can't out-exercise or you can't out-brain or outwit a bad diet. So always try to look and do some self-evaluation and say, hey, am I doing everything in my lifestyle that's best for me? Am I eating the right types of foods? Do I have good relationships? Is my life just totally stressful and crushing me right now? Because if it is, and if those things aren't working well, it's tough to heal. So just continue to advocate for yourself and do a little bit of reading and digging, because this stuff is pretty fresh and pretty new, and I'm excited for some of the new stuff to come out on this topic in particular.
Absolutely. Very well said, Dr. Cedermark. And I would be remiss if I did not bring up your podcast series or your video series, which has been, a great source of knowledge for me and I think a lot of patients out there. So can you talk about the Brain Chat a little bit?
Yeah, so I started Brain Chat because I was talking to a friend who he was a functional medicine practitioner, and he's like, nobody knows functional neurology. Like, I don't really get what you do. And I was like, all right, well, we'll just start we'll start like a Facebook page where we just post some things about it. So Brain Chat, it was kind of, the reason I made it was just to kind of do some little talks, and then it evolved into interviewing people like yourself who have knowledge in the functional neurology world and the functional medicine world. But then also what I just try to do with Brain Chat is just make a daily post about something that I'm interested in. And I always try to listen to followers' feedback and whatever they're interested in, because I like to do research and read stuff. So if I find a cool image or some cool information on the brain, then I like to just post it. So we have an Instagram account, a Facebook account, and then we also do little short monthly talks on different topics. So you can just follow us if you'd like on the Facebook page, Brain Chat, and feel free to message us. I'm the one behind the scenes answering the messages, so you can give me a hard time, no problem.
Perfect.
But yeah, Brain Chat's pretty fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for following.
Yeah, it's a great resource, absolutely. So if people wanted to find out more about you personally or find out more resources about the gut-brain axis, how would they do that?
If you just go to thebrainchat.com, that's our website. I actually have a cool I did a little PowerPoint presentation on the patient that I discussed about tonight. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the therapies we did, you can just go to thebrainchat.com and you can just message on Brain Chat's Facebook page, and I'll be the one answering.
Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us and share your wisdom on this topic. It was really great. I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure all of our listeners will as well. So again, thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, man.
Absolutely. So from the Neuro Wellness Podcast, this has been your host, Dr. Coppus. Be well.